morning again, everyone. In August of 1992, it was a long time ago. I recognize that some of you weren't even born then. I left Halifax, or actually I left Dartmouth to go for my first year in the seminary. And I attended St. Augustine Seminary in Scarborough, Ontario, so just outside of the downtown core of Toronto, right on Lake Ontario. This is the building that I lived in for 4 years. We did 4 years of study and 1 year internship. It was right on Lake Ontario, this big building. I was there with 100 other guys studying for the priesthood. And the building was built in 1913 by money donated by Eugene O'Keeffe, a very famous brewer of beer. You've heard of Carling O'Keeffe, same guy. The rector at the time used to say, instead of a dome in the middle of the building, we should have had a big, giant beer bottle. But anyway, the class that I was in, there was 24 of us from all across Canada, and I have to say, it was quite a colorful group of guys. I was one of the younger ones, but a lot of the other guys had had careers. Many of them had left the church for periods of time, had been away, lived very worldly lives, had been in the business world. One had owned a restaurant, one had been an atheist, one had been a professional cartoonist and working out in Hollywood, one had been a hockey player. It was really amazing. And I remember my first week in the seminary, we had a session, just the guys in my class, and I'll never forget this evening because we sat in a big circle and we told our stories about what had brought us to this place, what had brought us to begin a process to be trained and formed to become priests. The stories were amazing about how God broke into people's lives and turned lives around. And here's the thing. Before the story of a call to priesthood, there was a deeper story. And that story was a call to follow Jesus. In the gospel this weekend, we hear from the beginning of the Gospel of Mark about how Jesus called his first followers. And there's a lot packed into this short gospel. It's action-packed. It's urgent. St. Mark uses his most favorite word, immediately. Things happen immediately. And we know from other gospel accounts that this was not necessarily the first time Jesus had encountered Simon and Andrew and perhaps James and John. We hear in John's gospel, for instance, that he had already met Andrew and Andrew introduced his brother to him. So there was probably some interactions that we don't know about. Perhaps they had heard Jesus speak. Perhaps they had been in conversations. But nevertheless, it culminates in this moment where Jesus says to them, "Come and follow me." We can learn much from this gospel about what it means to be followers of Jesus. And I'd like to delve a bit deeper into this. And the first thing we can extract from the story is this, that we are all called. Now, I started my homily telling you about my time in the seminary, about those vocation stories. The word vocation means a calling. And the calling to priesthood is a specific call within the Christian life that some are called to. But the call to follow Jesus is directed to everyone. All are called to follow him. All are called to come to know him, not just to know about him, to study him as some intellectual pursuit or ethical exercise, but to know him, to fall in love with him, to fall in love with Jesus, who is already in love with us. This call is not preserved for a small number of special people, but it's directed to every single person, every single one of us. So if you've ever doubted if you have a calling, doubt no more. Jesus is calling every single one of us. And Jesus is calling us to follow him, to follow. Come, follow me, he says. And this invitation was in the style of the ancient rabbis or teachers who would call students to come with them, to be with them, to live with them, to listen to them, to travel with them, to pray with them. Essentially, it was a call into a relationship. A relationship. All of us are called not just to believe in Jesus, but called into a relationship with him. We are called also to a task. Jesus says, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of people." He says you'll be no longer catching fish, but catching people. And the task of catching people for the kingdom of God is repeated in several of the Gospels. Jesus uses this image frequently. And it reminds us that the missionary impulse at the heart of the Christian faith goes back to the very beginning of the ministry of Jesus. Christianity is inherently missionary. It's not an option. It's inherently missionary. And the call of Jesus on our lives includes a call for each and every single one of us to be his missionaries. We are called to trust. When Jesus calls Simon and his brother Andrew, we hear that they immediately left their nets. We hear that James and his brother John also left what was the family business and followed him. Now, this was as momentous a thing as it sounds. You see, fishing had been a way of life for generations of Galileans, possibly for hundreds and hundreds of years. Writing 40 years after the death of Jesus, the Jewish historian Josephus described a visit that he made to the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Sea of Galilee is about 30% bigger than the Bedford Basin. It's not this huge sea, it's like a big lake. And he said that he observed 330 fishing boats on lake. He must have slowly counted them all. He was very specific, 330 fishing boats. You see, this was an industry for the entire region. And just like today with fishing, it wasn't not everyone had a license to fish. These businesses would have been passed down through many, many generations. Simon and Andrew also were from the town of Bethsaida, which is a small town. It's now in ruins on near the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Well, the word Bethsaida means house of fish. See, there's a lot of fish stuff happening, right? And that has actually even impacted our parish. We are in the church of St. Peter's Church. And if you look over to the tabernacle, you see that above the tabernacle, what do you see? Fish. And the curtain that comes down around the tabernacle, what does that look like? It's a fishing net. Fish and fishing nets. Fishing nets and fishing boats represented identity, security, and family. And Jesus says, "Come follow me." And they leave them to follow Jesus. See, this is a call to trust. This is a radical trust to depend radically on God. And that's essentially what faith means, the life of faith. Jesus calls every single one of us to trust radically in him and to let go of all the false things in which we put our trust and find our security. We are called through the ordinary. Now, Jesus used many images during his ministry to describe his mission. He talked about caring for sheep, about planting, tending, and harvesting crops, and he also talked about catching fish. And in the gospel today, he talks to fishermen about catching fish. I wonder if he only spoke to shepherds about shepherding sheep and to farmers about bringing in crops. You see, Jesus called his followers through what was ordinary in their lives. It's as if he was saying, you have a particular experience, a life experience, a particular set of gifts, of skills. You have knowledge, and I want to use that knowledge and experience and the skills that you have for the sake of my kingdom. Jesus calls us through the ordinary. And not only this, but he also calls the ordinary. Think about it. Jesus didn't go to the temple in Jerusalem to call his first followers. He didn't go to the seminary. He didn't go to the rabbinical schools or to the scholars or the scribes and the Pharisees. He went to the beach. And he recruited men with calloused hands who smelled like fish. You see, God can do extraordinary things through ordinary people. Now, in case you're wondering about this picture, I was looking for a photograph of a bunch of parishioners, and that's the first one I found, so I used it. So if you're in it or not in it, don't worry about it. It doesn't mean anything. Except for the fact that ordinary people, the ordinary people of our parish, can be used by God to do extraordinary things. You see, it's always been this way, and it always will be this way. Ordinary people like you and me, he just needs us to give our yes. And in order to give our yes, we need to be able to hear and answer his call. A call that can come to us even in the middle of a busy day's work. It's a call to relationship, a call to mission, a call to trust, a call that comes through the ordinariness of life. You see, Jesus is calling every single one of us. Oh, come on, that's good, eh? The question is, can we hear his call? Or is our phone on silent? Is it on do not disturb? You know, my mother sometimes drives me crazy because she never answers her cell phone. About 95% of the time, I don't know why I bother calling her cell phone. She never answers. And when I get through to her in the home line, I'll say, how come you didn't answer your cell phone? She says, oh, I've got the volume turned down. I say, Mom, people like you should be banned from owning cell phones. Is the ringer turned off on our phones? Is do not disturb on? This week, I invite you to listen, to assume a posture of listening as you go about your everyday activities, as you go about the ordinariness of life. Ask the Lord for the grace to hear him speak, to hear his voice, to hear him call, to hear him speak to each and every single one of our hearts. Come, follow me.